It's an interesting one because it's such a big political issue today. However, it was not a big issue with the founders, nor with the generations that came after that in the 1800s. That's because the founders and the leaders for about a century after that were concerned not with outcome, but with process. Income inequality is an outcome. The process of equality of opportunity was what was important to the founders and the generations after that. In fact, we see this written in the Declaration of Independence. We talk about the right to pursue happiness. Pursuit of happiness is a process. Happiness is an outcome. We have a right to pursue an outcome. Not the right to happiness, but the right to pursue happiness. So equality of opportunity was important to the founders, and many of the political issues in the 1800s, the anti-slavery movement, women's suffrage, this sort of thing, are issues connected with improving equality of opportunity. Our rights come from God. Government exists to protect those rights, not to create a certain outcome. So income inequality was not a serious issue with the founders. In fact, they assumed in a free society that incomes would be unequal because we have differences among us, different abilities, we have different work ethic, amount of work that we're willing to do. We have differences in our family support, family connections, differences in luck. All of this create very different outcomes. So a difference in income is to be assumed if you have equality of opportunity. In other words, in a free society, you will have income inequality. Well, the founders and others also believe that there's good things that happen when you have people that have the wealth to create capital. You have job creation. You have the creation of whole industries, all of which improve the equality of opportunity or improve the process for others in this country to succeed. The first president to think differently, at least to make statements that were significantly different from those of the founders, were in the progressive era. The first was Theodore Roosevelt. Interestingly, he didn't do it even during his presidency. He waited till he was out of the presidency, although he was going to run for president again. In his speech on the New Nationalism in 1910, 104 years ago, he introduced the idea that income inequality should be in America a serious issue. He said this: "The really big fortune, the swollen fortune, by the mere fact of its size acquires qualities which differentiate it in kind as well as in degree from what is possessed by men of relatively small means. Therefore, I believe in a graduated income tax on big fortunes." That's interesting, isn't it? He said, the really big fortune, the swollen fortune, by the mere fact of its size, acquires qualities which differentiate it in kind as well as in degree from what is possessed by men of relatively small means. Therefore, he favors a progressive income tax. And so we see, right, equality of the law will not be extended to all people because people with a lot of wealth, swollen fortunes, by the mere fact of their size, acquire qualities that differentiate it from smaller fortunes. Therefore, the government is required to take action. It wasn't long after this we had our first income tax, a progressive income tax, but the top rate was only 7%. So I guess these swollen fortunes, 7% was sufficient. But it's interesting to look at the progressive mentality and how that changes over time. Once you've established the principle that you can tax and create income inequality, where is the stopping point? Well, it was 7% in 1913. 2 years later, Woodrow Wilson, as president, promoted and approved an increase in the top rate, this is the top marginal rate of income tax, to 15%. Throughout much of the 1920s, the top rate was 25% of your income goes to the U.S. government. The top marginal rate was 25%. Under President Hoover in the early 1930s, 63%. Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore's cousin, Well, he's not to be outdone. He gets it up to 79%. And then finally, ending at 94% tax on all income over $200,000. And that, by the way, was a compromise. He wanted 100%. And the 100% bill couldn't make it through Congress. He wanted 100% tax on all income over $25,000, which would be real income equality in this nation. And then at one point he had a 3-year plan for a 100.6% tax on millionaires. And that's an effective tax, not a marginal tax, which means if you earned $1 million, you owed $1,006,000. And it's interesting to look at the change in the debate that occurred. Emanuel Seller, congressman from New York, in debating this large 100+% income tax, said, quote, "The government can at any time make income taxes as thumping big as the necessities of war require." This is during World War II. Thus, if any plan does not raise enough money, taxes can be at any time increased. The government always has a moral, if not an actual, lien on all of our income. In other words, government is no longer instituted to protect rights. Government is instituted to create income equality. Senator Happy Chandler of Kentucky said it this way: "Mr. President, all of us owe the government. We owe it for everything we have. And that is the basis of obligation. And the government can take everything we have if the government needs it." That's interesting, isn't it? If the government needs it. The government can assert its right to have all the taxes it needs for any purpose, either now or at any time in the future. Now, that's interesting to think of this 100% or 100+%, how you go from 7% up to 100%. And we had in Congress a debate on this. As you might imagine, some of the questions, I guess, would be obvious. Charles Gifford, congressman from Massachusetts, says, "For 3 long years, this man has to pay more than he receives. How does he pay his other taxes? How does he make his living expenses?" One of Roosevelt's supporters, Congressman Jerry Cooper of Tennessee, said it this way: "It may not be possible to pay more than 1 year's taxes out of 1 year's income." But with few exceptions, persons in the higher brackets have assets that they can use to pay it. And so that's how one pays a 100% tax or more than a 100% tax. But we ended up, as I say, at 94% tax on all income over $200,000. Well, the first phase then of income inequality is dealt with by the Roosevelts. The issue receded after World War II and into the 1950s. It's picked up in earnest today and has been periodically in the late 1900s. Our speakers today are very knowledgeable on this issue, and I'm excited to have them up here. We're going to learn a lot from them. Our first speaker today is Michael Tanner. Let me introduce him. Michael Tanner is Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, where he heads research into domestic policies with a particular emphasis on health care reform, social welfare policy, and Social Security. Michael is a prolific writer and frequent guest lecturer. He appears regularly on network and cable news programs, and his work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Most recently, he wrote Obamacare, What We Know Now, which is an updated analysis of the health care reform law after the first few months of open enrollment. Michael has spoken for us before at the Free Market Forum, and we are glad to have him back. His lecture today is entitled The History of Income Inequality in the United States, but the emphasis here is on some myths of income inequality. Please welcome Michael Tanner.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be back at the Free Market Forum and to see folks that I've seen before and meet so many new folks. and to celebrate the incredible work that Hillsdale does. I really appreciate it. You know, I do think when we start taking this whole subject of inequality, last weekend I was in Bulgaria, actually, and as I was driving in from the airport, the taxi driver picked me up, and as we drove in from the airport on the outskirts of Sofia, there was row upon row of these Soviet-era cinder block apartment buildings, these featureless, crumbling, gray buildings there, just kind of with these little tiny windows, and there were just row upon row of them. And the taxi driver motioned to them and looked over and said, "Ah, communism." But at least I guess they were all equal. Inequality is the topic of the day. I mean, everyone is lecturing us today on inequality. President Obama talks about it all the time. Just last week, Janet Yellen, the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, gave us a lecture on why inequality is bad. It has something to do with the money supply, I guess, or something. Maybe if they had Bitcoin, we'd all be more equal. You know, Paul Krugman writes a column on it every other day. So we're talking a lot about inequality, but of course, you know, this whole thing now stems from Thomas Piketty's great paperweight that he brought out recently, Das Kapital. I'm sorry, no, that was Capital in the 21st Century, in which he elicits on this theory that we have this growing rate of inequality in not just America, but the entire world, and it's steadily growing worse, and it's never going to turn around unless something takes action, and then it's going to just sort of consume everything out there. And you know, I'm not going to get into a debate about Piketty's methodology and you know, his sort of strange fascination with 10-year averaging that he does, and sort of where he extrapolates data where none exists and that sort of thing. Because economists do that sort of thing. I mean, I'm not going to get into whether he should or shouldn't and all that sort of thing. What I'd like to do is look at some deeper, more fundamental myths that underlie the whole inequality debate, and maybe take a look at them and what they mean for what we're trying to do here. And number one, I think the biggest myth of all is that inequality is worse than it's ever been, and going to get still worse still in the future. That the rich are just eating up an ever bigger portion of the pie. You know, I don't know, years ago, my wife and I fell in love with a French cartoon called Mons the Cat, in which there was this cat that just kept eating and got bigger and bigger, and would eat everything until, you know, eventually it got bigger than a room, bigger than a house, until one day it explodes. And I guess that's what's going to happen to the Koch brothers someday under this theory. But you know, that's the theory out there. There's this huge amount of inequality. Well, even if you look at Piketty's numbers, that's not exactly true. I mean, for much of the history of this country, inequality was higher even than it is today. Now, it is true that beginning in the 1940s with Roosevelt, with the high tax rates you just heard about, with the rise of unionization, with regulation, and a number of other things, plus changes in the composition of the workforce, that you had a decline in inequality that lasted for a number of years and began to rise probably in the 1980s. It began to rise back up, and we're back up roughly to the levels that it was before. But those measures that Piketty uses are somewhat misleading because they tend to focus on income but leave out the massive redistributionary state that we have today. Robert's got a terrific paper that he's going to talk about later. It talks about the massiveness of the redistribution that goes on within our system today, both in terms of taxes and benefits. And those are not taken into account in any of these inequality works. For example, taxes, and we have one of the most progressive tax systems in the world. We think about the much higher tax systems in Europe, and in total taxes, they tend to have a much higher tax burden. But their tax systems are actually much more regressive because they rely heavily on consumption-based taxes than on income taxes, so that they actually fall on lower and middle income people more heavily than they do on the wealthy in many cases. They have high income tax rates, but they don't collect that much in terms of the income from them. We have a very progressive tax system, and in fact, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office, they estimate that that income in the top 1% peaked at 18.7% in 2007 before falling back to about 14.9% in 2010. But all you have to do is include taxes to make that from before tax income to after tax income, and that 14.9% declines to 12.8% of national income. So you have a 2% gap, about 1/7 decline, just by including taxes in that equation. And you have an even bigger impact on inequality when you look at the benefits that are distributed, because those benefits go highly disproportionately to lower income individuals. And it's not just conservatives or free market types that think this. You can look at a study by Gary Burton of the Brookings Institution. Now, I've debated Gary Burton many occasions on issues from Social Security to health care reform to welfare policy, and I can tell you, he's not a right-winger. But he has shown that income inequality in the United States, after you take into account taxes and the redistribution of benefits that people receive, has actually declined since the turn of the century in the United States. It's actually going down. Similar, there's a study by Richard Burkhauser that says if you can't control for changes in household composition and transfers, be it both the cash and in kind, income has basically gone up for everybody in the United States from 1979 roughly to about 2007, just before the recession hit. So you basically have an income going up for everybody in this country over that period of time, but slower for people in the top quintile, and fastest for people on the bottom, once you take into account taxes and transfers. So you have to consider that kind of data. Second, you also have to look at the work by Alan Reynolds and others that have indicated that a lot of what we're seeing in terms of income growth among the top 1% is misleading because it's really just kind of a restatement of income that results from the tax code, that we had a lot of tax changes in the 1980s that encouraged people to list their taxes very differently. What you had is Schedule C corporations letting their earnings pass through to the owner's individual tax reforms via partnerships, and Subchapter S corporations. Money that was considered probably corporate income before is now being listed on individual income taxes and therefore being considered income that way. And that makes people's income appear to be higher when in reality it is not any higher. So it's sort of a numerical mirage, if you will. In fact, one way, if you actually want to look at whether income is actually worse than others, is to look at consumption. Are people spending more than others? Now, there is inequality in consumption. The rich spend a lot more than the poor. This shouldn't be surprising. But it's actually been remarkably stable over time, that you're not seeing big swings in consumption where the rich are starting to spend a whole lot more than they were before and the poor are spending a whole lot less than they were before. You're actually finding that consumption among those two groups has been remarkably stable over time, which suggests that incomes over that same period of time have been remarkably stable. So certainly, at least if we can look back and say, yes, income inequality has probably grown somewhat since the 80s, but nowhere near to the level that people have claimed. Well, Piketty and others would say, okay, that's just talking about income, but what we're really talking about is wealth. There's his magic equation where R is greater than G, which most economists say isn't actually true, but he has that built in and says, the wealth of the 1% is getting bigger all the time. But even that doesn't seem to hold out. They may be saving rather than spending, which is probably true, which is one reason why their consumption may not be going up. But according to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, the wealthiest 1% of Americans held 34.4% of U.S. wealth in 1969. That's during the period when Piketty was very happy with with income equality. By 2010, which is the last year in which we have data from that survey, that proposal had risen to 35.4%, 1% increase since the 1960s in the amount of wealth held by the richest Americans. That's not evidence of Mons the cat. That's not ever-growing wealth. But let me raise one other issue then, if I can, in all this, because even if Piketty was right and inequality was growing, even if all those studies and surveys were wrong, and I don't think they are, but even if they were, I don't care. No one has yet explained to me why we should care about inequality. I mean, the one reason, I guess, is supposed to be, well, a fairness issue. It's unfair that the rich are getting richer and the poor, or something like that. Now, it could be a philosophical fairness issue. People are just upset that someone has more than they do. And I'm not going to convince people that that's wrong or whatever, and I'm not going to try. But the other sort of one is that there's sort of this mythology about the rich that suggests that, well, the rich are basically lying out at the pool, sipping some martinis, and the money's just kind of coming in. There's two groups of rich people. One, they all inherited it. And the second, well, they're just trading, cutting coupons and trading stocks and stuff like that. They're not really working for their money either. So the rich don't really earn it and all that. But that's not really true. In fact, very few of the rich inherited their money. 80% of American millionaires are the first generation of their family to attain that amount of wealth. Only 19% received any significant income or wealth from a trust fund or an estate, and fewer than 20% inherited 10% or more of their wealth. Among the richest 1% of Americans, inheritance accounted for just 15% of their wealth. Now, that's probably still a lot of money, but, they did earn most of what they have. And in fact, the role of inheritance has been diminishing. A 2012 study by Chicago Booth professor Stephen Neal Kaplan and Joshua Rao of Stanford found that fewer of those who made it into the Forbes 400 list in recent years grew up wealthy than in previous decades, falling from 60% in 1982 to just 32% today. It is essentially entrepreneurs who are becoming rich. Nor is it a question just of people sitting back and trading stocks and bonds. Wage income is actually responsible for a majority of the income of wealthy Americans. Among the top 10% in terms of wealth, wages account for 55.8% of their net worth, an increase from 42.6% as recently as 2007. So wages are becoming more important, not less, as Piketty and others would have you believe. In fact, the rich are not primarily stock traders. According to one survey of the top 1% of richest Americans, only about 14% are involved in banking or finance. Roughly a third are entrepreneurs or managers. 16% are doctors or other medical professionals. 8% are lawyers. Okay, we have to forgive them. Engineers, scientists, computer professionals make up 6%. Sports and entertainment figures 2%. And among the ultra-wealthy, okay, there's slightly more to be involved in finance, banking, and investments, but only 22% of the ultra-wealthy are involved in those type of activities. Most start businesses, which employ a lot of people, and earn their money. And they work harder than the average American. The number in fact, the higher your income, the more likely you are to work more than 40 hours a week. Now, no one wants to dispute that people who work in the factories or the mines or whatever work very hard. But the number of hours they work tends to be less than the people managing those businesses. The number, if you look at people who work over 40 hours a week, for example, is much higher. The higher your income, the more likely you are to work over 40 hours a week. That's significantly an increase. Second, I don't care because I care about poverty, not inequality, and there is no evidence that the two are connected. I mean, I want you to think about this. if we were to double everybody's income tomorrow, it would be wonderful for poverty. Think of how many people would no longer be poor. And we do nothing whatsoever about inequality in this country. You know, Piketty dismisses China. He's very critical, in fact, of China, saying after capitalism came to China, inequality bloomed in that country. Just ignoring the fact that capitalism coming to China did more to eliminate poverty than perhaps anything in recent times. How many people are better off, despite the fact that there are now some billionaires in China? Were they all better off, you know, when they're out there under Mao working the rice fields? I mean, he would have been happy in Bulgaria. The rich don't necessarily stay rich anyway. In fact, the evidence suggests that studies that a family that's rich today isn't necessarily going to have family by the time their grandkids are around. 70% of wealth from the rich evaporates by the third generation, by the second generation, as much as 90% by the third generation. You know, the kids don't necessarily spend it all that well. Something to think about when you write your will. In fact, actually, when I started off to do this paper, I started to look at, started thinking about the great wealthy families. And well, you know, we all know they're all out there, right? The DuPonts and the Rockefellers and the Hearsts. Well, actually, we looked at the Fortune 400 list, and none of the 16 DuPont heirs are on it, nor any of the Hearsts. There's one Rockefeller on the Fortune 400 list, 99-year-old David. You know, these families are not staying among the richest in America. At the same time, we're not seeing a decline in mobility among the poor. In fact, roughly half of those who begin in the bottom quintile move up to a higher quintile within 10 years. And their children will tend to rise even further. 1 out of every 5 children born to parents in the bottom income quintile will reach one of the top 2 income quintiles in adulthood. Now, I have to say this has been relatively flat over recent years, which suggests that the income redistribution we've been doing hasn't raised that up. But neither has inequality made it worse. What we're seeing is that the chances of the poor getting rich are about what they were previously. So we're not seeing changes in that regard. Greater income inequality does not mean that the poor are worse off. And finally, I want to just raise one last issue, and that is the question of whether or not we can help the poor by tearing down the rich. Whether or not we can punish those evil rich people without hurting the poor. You know, you don't have to be an aficionado of the Laffer curve to realize that the suggestions that are out there, Piketty's 80% income tax, federal income tax, Roosevelt's 100% tax, are probably going to discourage a certain amount of wealth creation. And in fact, they acknowledge this. You know, I mean, I don't think Piketty's a fan of Art Laffer, but he actually acknowledges that he's not going to get any income from his 80% tax, so he knows he's not financing any social programs with it. He's not going to be able to redistribute it. He just thinks it'll discourage people from making money, which he thinks is a good thing. The problem is, if you discourage those people from making money, it also discourages them from investing that money in jobs and businesses and things that will enable people to get out of poverty. There's actually, I think, been recently a terrific study by the Tax Foundation. Again, not particularly right-wing group, sort of a middle-of-the-road group. And they looked at this, and they said that if you raise the top income tax rates to 80%, GDP would decrease by 3.5%, wages would drop by 1.6%, capital stocks would be 7.4% less, and there'd be 2.1 million fewer jobs. That would sure help the poor. Look, I think this country should have a debate over how we deal with poverty in this country. I think it's a shame that 50 years after the war on poverty, we've accomplished so little in terms of ending poverty. But the debate we're having about inequality has nothing whatsoever to do with this. And if we continue to focus on these myths, and we continue to simply resent those who do well, then we're never going to get around to the type of solutions that might actually help people. And that would be a real tragedy. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Our next speaker is Robert Rector. Robert is a senior research fellow in domestic policy at the Heritage Foundation. His major research interests include the study of poverty and inequality, welfare reform, immigration, and marriage and family. Robert's writings have indeed made a difference. He played a major role in crafting the 1996 federal welfare reform law, which for the first time required those who receive welfare to work or get job training in exchange for benefits. Robert has been active since 1996, working with Congress to ensure that work requirements continue to be part of our welfare system. His book, entitled America's Failed $5.4 Trillion War on Poverty, helped pave the way for welfare reform in 1996. One of his recent articles describes the welfare state as it has in fact emerged. That article is aptly entitled, The War on Poverty, 50 Years of Failure. We are delighted and honored to have Robert Rector with us today. His talk is entitled, The Effects of Government Intervention.
Just an obiter dictum that I can't avoid throwing in since we're talking about Piketty. Before the current tome on wealth, there was a previous tome on income inequality by Piketty and Saez. For those of you who have not read that, that's a wonderful 600 pages. Yeah, the short version. Basically, he talks about the share of income of the top 1%, which is allegedly around 20% of total income. There's you might imagine, a falsehood in that study, and I just wanted to throw it out in this audience. When he calculates the income share of the top 1%, he has an artificial denominator, as you must have in any ratio, and his denominator is false. His denominator, he asserts, is 80% of total personal income in any given year. It's not. It shrinks over time. It starts at around 80%, but as it goes down, it falls to around 55% of personal income. Well, that in and of itself generates a substantial amount of the growth in inequality that he's allegedly finding, and they obscure this fact, to say the least, in page 598. So today I'm going to talk to you about a very simple subject. How much income does the government redistribute? What is the balance of benefits and taxes? And a simpler question is, what's the break-even level? At what level in our society does a typical household pay enough in taxes to fund all the benefits that they receive from the government? And the way I'm going to do this is in a normal set of income quintiles, as shown by the census, in which you break households out into 5 equal groups of households and show their share of taxes and benefits, or show their share of income. This study is unusual in the sense that what I'm going to talk about here is the total cost of government and all taxes paid by government. You don't usually see that. You usually see something that's much more limited than that. And to talk about that, I first of all want to talk about what government does, because I categorize government expenditures into 6 categories, and it's important to understand those because I'm covering all of them. The first I call direct benefits. It's fairly simple. That's Social Security, unemployment insurance, workman's comp, generally cash benefits. Medicare is in there, that go to the general population. This data is available in the census, including even Medicare, although you don't usually find out about that. It's kind of hidden in there and not reported, and so you can analyze it from that basis. The second category is what I call means-tested assistance. These are programs that provide cash, food, housing, medical care to lower income people, and you would know these are the refundable earned income tax credit, supplemental security income, food stamps, Medicaid, and so forth. Those data are also, interestingly, in the normal census take. They ask people, how much did you get in food stamps? Were you enrolled in Medicaid? They have the average cost of Medicaid per person in each state and so forth. But again, those pieces of information are largely never reported, never incorporated in any income distribution or any poverty data for that matter. The third category is education. On average, it costs around $12,000 per child to put a child 1 year in a public school in the United States. Now, if the parent is earning $10,000 a year, I think we can rest assured that someone else paid that $12,000 cost, and we might ask whether or not that cost is giving utility for the amount, but it's clearly someone is paying that cost, and you can, again, go into the census, determine whether a child is in public school, and what I've done is just to assign the average per capita cost in the state that the child is in. You could do it on a more finite basis by district or something, but I actually think that would show greater redistribution because the expenditures in urban centers are in fact quite high per child. Now, the third category is a little bit more obscure, and it's what I call population-based services. When someone comes into a community, the generalized services in that community have to increase. You have to have more policemen, more roads, and so forth. These are sometimes called public goods, but they're really not public goods in the economic sense, in the sense that when you add more people into to receive these services, you either have to expand them or the quality of the service goes down. Sewers and roads are the most obvious example of that. Now, in a pure public good, the addition of another utilizer of that good does not diminish its equality. So what's an example of a pure public good? Well, public good, obviously, the classic example is a lighthouse. It doesn't matter how many ships pass in front of the lighthouse. It still works. But a more contemporary example might be a cure for cancer. If NIH comes up with a cure for cancer, it doesn't matter how many people use that cure for cancer. Everybody gets the same benefit. It's not diminished by the addition of a user. By contrast, a private good is a hamburger. If I eat the hamburger, you can't eat the hamburger. That's the end of the story. In fact, most things in government are not public goods. We have separated out public goods. Those include national defense. They include scientific research. But a lot of things that are called public goods are just really things like roads, policemen, firemen, other things where the amount of the service has to be proportional to the population. So if you have an increase in a number of people who aren't paying taxes in a community, that service has to increase, and somebody else has to pay for it. How could you possibly estimate something like that? Well, and I'll come back to this when we talk a little bit about, well, I'll go into this. In addition to the Census Income Survey, we have at the Labor Department something called the Consumption Survey, which by income class gives you very detailed information about how much each income group and each household is spending on particular things. So how could you estimate, for example, how much a group of households are consuming in terms of highway services funded by the government? Well, that would be in proportion really to the utilization of the highways. How could you determine that? Well, you can actually go into the Consumer Expenditure Survey and find out how much this household paid on gasoline, which is clearly proportionate overall to their use of the highway relative to other households. Now, similar thing when we'll talk on the tax side about sales taxes. How can you allocate sales taxes? How could you allocate a tax, say, like tobacco tax? Well, again, it's fairly simple. You can go right into the Consumer Expenditure Survey. You can analyze the share of tobacco purchases by income class or by any other class you want to, and allocate those proportionately, and that would be the proportionate distribution of those taxes. So we have these population-based services, fire, sewers, police, so forth, And then we have pure public goods, which are not in this analysis. And then finally, interest on the debt for previous government services that could be included, but I've laid that off. So basically, we've got direct benefits here like Social Security and Medicare, welfare, education, and then these population-based services like roads, highways, postal service, and things like that. I have over 30 different categories in these calculations. On the tax side, we have 35 different taxes, right all the way down to lottery payments. How in the world could you figure out what the class distribution of lottery payments is? Well, there actually is research on this, and you just have to go and who buys lottery tickets? Well, lottery tickets happen to be an incredibly regressive tax because only people that aren't particularly smart buy them. And and so it tends to be concentrated in certain groups. It's a regressive tax, and I have that in there. I have all the excise taxes, wealth tax. You could quibble a little bit about the incidence of some of these. I've tended to shift this to put more tax burden onto the poor. I assume that laborers, for example, pay half of corporate income tax. You could say, no, that's not true, but I've tried to make this a liberalish analysis. It doesn't really matter that much. So then we'll come to the first picture here. This is the distribution in aggregate in 2004 of in the blue are the taxes paid in aggregate, and red is benefits received by each quintile. And if you look on the right-hand side, this is the top quintile, the evil group. They are paying, at that time, $1.6 trillion in taxes, received about $500 billion in services. And you look down at the bottom, the first quintile, they paid about $98 billion in taxes and received about $670 billion in red in services. Now, if you look at the red, it looks actually fairly flat. There's not a lot of redistribution of benefits there, but as we'll come back to, there's an explanation for that, and part of the explanation is that the first quintile is essentially like an old English rotten borough. There's no one in it, okay? It represents 20% of all households, but these households are typically 1- and 2-person households. So the number of people in this quintile is about half the other quintiles. So the per capita distribution of benefits is actually much higher in that group. Now we come to the next one. This simply shows the surplus and deficit for each quintile. How much, if you're in surplus, your quintile or your household, you paid more in taxes than you received back in benefits. If you're in deficit, you obviously had more in benefits than you paid in taxes. And what you can see is the top quintile paid about $1.1 trillion more in taxes than they received in government benefits. The bottom quintile received about $600 billion more in benefits than they paid in taxes. Some of the surplus in the top quintile goes to pay for public goods like national defense, but the bulk of it is actually what is a transfer from the top to the bottom, and the net transfer there in 2004 was around $1 trillion. The top two quintiles pay $1 trillion more in taxes than they receive in benefits, and that $1 trillion is redistributed down to the bottom three. This probably doesn't surprise anyone, but it's very interesting that we almost never talk about this. There's almost no literature on this. The Tax Foundation has done this occasionally going back into the 1970s. Liberal academics avoid this subject like the absolute plague. I mean, it's the simplest question. This seems to be a very basic question, right? Because actually, some people in Washington are under the illusion, or some average voters, that the government is in the business of defense and education. Now, the government is really in the business of income redistribution. It has been through the 20th century, so we ought to measure how much it's redistributing. Well, here it is, about $1 trillion a year. That $1 trillion that's taken from the top and given to the bottom represented around 9% of national income in that year. A lot of conservatives would think it's actually more than that. Liberals don't think that this redistribution occurs at all, so it's pretty surprising to them. I'm sure that Paul Krugman is analyzing this data relentlessly every day. So now we take a look at the same thing. We're going to look at a per household basis. These are the average households within each quintile. And up at the top, we find that the average household in the top quintile paid about $70,000 in taxes, received about $21,000 in benefits. So there's a gap there of around $50,000 was their surplus that they contributed, most of which did not go to public goods such as national defense, but rather went to the benefits for the bottom 3 quintiles. You come down to the bottom quintile, they are getting about $30,000 a year in benefits and paying about $4,000 in taxes. So there's about a $25,000 gap there that they have to, that someone else is paying for those benefits and services. And this just puts the gaps and surpluses into absolute terms. Now, this one is slightly, this is a per capitized value, and I just go back to remember that we said that it looked like the benefits, at least per household, were relatively flat across the income quintiles. Again, that is because of the little-known fact that there isn't anyone in the bottom quintile. So if there isn't anyone there, you can't even redistribute to them very much because they have half the number of people in that quintile compared to the other quintiles. By contrast, the top quintile has about 20% more than average people, and it has an overwhelming abundant share of the earners in the United States are in that quintile. And so when you per capitize these benefits, you can clearly see the blue line is showing that the bottom quintile per person is getting around $16,000 per person. Top quintile is getting around $6,700. So not only are the taxes highly progressive in the sense that the top is taxed much more heavily, but the benefits are also, once you make this adjustment, are disproportionately favor the bottom, as one would expect. Now, the next number here is what I would call the taking to giving ratio. This is the benefits and services received by each quintile relative to $1 of taxes paid in. And what you see there is that the bottom quintile was getting close to $7 of benefits for every dollar of taxes they pay in. That's their taking ratio. And the top quintile is getting 31 cents of benefits for every dollar of taxes paid. That's effectively their giving ratio. I would suspect if we were in a room with liberals and conservatives mixed together, that liberals would say, well, that's not enough. You know, we need to redistribute more. And conservatives would say, this is a lot. You know, there's a lot of redistribution here. I think one thing that we ought to say that everyone should agree on but would not is that you ought to at least be honest about the amount of redistribution the government's already doing. Before you go out and say, let's raise those taxes, let's redistribute more, you ought to actually calculate how much you're currently redistributing. That seems to me to be a sort of common sense. You know, you can't know where you want to go unless you know where you are. But in fact, the left hates this issue. And when I first went into this about 10 years ago, I went to my intern and I said, you know, this is an interesting question. What's the average break-even point? What does a household have to pay in taxes to match the benefits they get? And what's the overall distribution of this? They go, there must be an abundance of literature about this. Go out and find it all. And the intern came back and said, can't find anything, you know? And eventually we tracked down that there is a very small body of conservative literature on this going back to the 1970s. But liberal academics avoid this question absolutely like the plague. They don't want to talk about it because if you talk about it, in fact, it may question what bang you're getting for the redistribution you're already giving and whether or not you really need to do a lot more. If we were to summarize all together, what we would see is that the conventional figures of the pre-tax, pre-distribution, pre-benefit ratio show that the top quintile gets around half of all income and the bottom quintile gets maybe 3% of all income. So the ratio of the top to bottom, 50 to 3, is around 17 to 1, okay? What my analysis is showing here is if you take the taxes paid by both groups and the benefits paid by both groups, then the overall share of economic resources falls to something like 42 to 5. So it falls from around 17 to 1 top to bottom to around 7 to 8 to 1 top to bottom. But then we come back to this really very large but almost completely unknown fact that there is no one in the bottom quintile. It's difficult to give money to people that aren't there, okay? And because they have roughly half the number of people of the other quintiles, that's one of the reasons why they have a low share of income, because there's no one in this rotten borough. And this has been known academically forever, but the left absolutely does not want to talk about this. And so if you equalize the share of the quintile so that they have equal number of people in them, what you find then is that the top quintile would have around 40% of income, the bottom quintile has around 10% of the income if you equalize the shares of the population. And so that overall ratio of top to bottom goes from the normal Census Bureau figure showing the top quintile has $17 for every dollar in the bottom. Well, you add in the benefits and taxes, and then you make it so that each quintile has an equal share of population. That 17 to 1 ratio drops to about 4 to 1. It's rather difficult, I think, for Piketty to make much headway with that number, which is why this is the last time you will ever see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. And we've left some time to redistribute to our last speaker, Tim Carney. Tim is senior political columnist at the Washington Examiner. He is also a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I met Tim in 2012 for the first time when he came to Hillsdale College as our Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Fellow in journalism. Tim is a protege of the late Robert Novak. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and many other publications. He is the author of 2 books, and I have read them both with interest. The first book is entitled The Big Ripoff, and that book won the Templeton Enterprise Award and also the Lysander Spooner Award as the best book on liberty. Tim's second book is entitled Obamanomics, written in 2009. Tim is a native of Greenwich Village, and he is an alumnus of St. John's College in Annapolis. He now lives in the D.C. area with his wife and children. His speech today is entitled Income Inequality as a Political Issue. Please welcome Tim Carney.
Thank you, Hillsdale, for having me here. Thank all of you for coming. In Washington, D.C., this is almost a stereotypical right-wing lineup here to have Cato, Heritage, and AEI, where I do my fellowship. But if you read the liberal press, they don't distinguish between any of them. They don't know the difference between a libertarian and a conservative, for instance. And I try to set them straight. And one way I demonstrate is I say, how many libertarians does it take to change a light bulb? Don't worry, the market will take care of it. How many conservatives does it take to change a light bulb? Change. If you've got that, you've got them straight. And at AEI, of course, we're not afraid of the dark, so you don't even have to worry about it. I'm a political reporter, and I'm not an economist, but I do read the polls. I travel the country. I just came up from Menifee County, Kentucky, one of the poorest counties in America. I've been following the races in the polls and following inequality as an issue. And I think that it was a big emphasis. In the end of 2013, President Obama went to a poor D.C. neighborhood and gave a speech, and his words were, I believe this is the defining challenge of our time. making sure our economy works for every working American. It's why I ran for president. He called inequality a fundamental threat to the American dream, our way of life, and what we stand for around the globe. It was the theme of his State of the Union a month later. Pay close attention to the Senate candidates that are out there in the top races, the top Democrats, who are all getting detailed polling and exit and focus group and responses to their things. Inequality has almost disappeared. And if you look at the polling, you see people care about it, but in a nuanced way that tells us a different story than what the Democrats thought in December 2013, what they thought in January 2014. They have learned, and we can learn from their reactions, what the American public actually thinks about inequality and how it works as a political issue. Nowadays, Democrats, they talk war on women. Some of them are even campaigning. The same ones who were talking about inequality a year ago are now campaigning on increasing subsidy programs like the Export-Import Bank, which mostly goes to Boeing. Speaking of inequality, they get 40% of Exim subsidies. But they have kept up their billionaire bashing at the same time. Again, there's a nuanced picture. I think we can make sense of it when we look closely at it. So first, polling data. The way I read the sum of all the polling data is that Americans see economic inequality as a growing thing, and they see that as bad. They don't like that. So they don't have the who cares answer that some of us do. They don't like it. But they don't care very intensely about it. There's a typical poll, Politico just asked an open-ended question, what are the issues that you really care about? And you could list up to 10. Of all the people who answered, listing up to 10 top issues that they really cared about, only 1% of them even mentioned income inequality or poverty. Either one of those showed up about 1%. And there are lots of other polls like that. But some quick numbers. When asked if America's getting more unequal, if the gap is growing, overwhelming majorities in the last year say yes. 80%, 75% in two polls that were taken back in January. In January 2012, people were asked about fairness. That was more evenly divided. 49% said the economy is unfair, while 45% said it's fair. Consistently, Gallup asks, should money and wealth be more evenly distributed? And there, though, you get 60% saying yes, they should be more evenly distributed than it is now. What should be done about it? Very little consensus on that. Here was a recent poll, Bloomberg poll question. In thinking about the gap between the rich and everyone else, do you think it would be better for the government to implement policies designed to shrink that gap, or better for the government to stand aside and let the market operate freely even if the gap gets wider? There you got a slightly more people saying the latter, saying let the market operate, as opposed to the government should intervene. The first thing you'll learn, anytime polls are asked on issue questions, and somebody tries to summarize what the question is, ask them what the specific wording of the question was, because you just see very different responses depending on the wording of the question. Again, you have to look at the whole picture, and the whole picture I see is generally people think inequality is getting worse, they don't like it, and they like the general notion of government doing something about it. But when it comes to what they want the government to do about it, and what they think about the rich and what they think about the poor, again, it's a lot more subtle. So I looked at the 12 most competitive U.S. Senate races, and looking at the Democratic candidates, 9 of them have these issues pages. And if you look at a minor House candidate, they might have an issues page where they go and they tick off what they think about every issue. And that's a guy who likes to tell everybody around him what he thinks about every issue, and that's why he's running for Congress. Not because he thinks he's going to win, but all of a sudden, you know, some people are going to listen to what he thinks about every single issue, about how to pave the roads, about what color the line should be in the middle. But top-tier candidates, they use the issues as a way to express what their priorities are, what they want people to know about them. So 9 of these top Senate races had issues or priorities pages with an average of 9.5 top-line issues. You look at them, inequality or poverty showed up 0 times among the Democratic candidates. A few campaigns had equality, but that wasn't about wealth or income equality. That was about things like gay marriage, anti-discrimination laws, or maybe about male-female pay gap. The closest was Iowa Senate candidate Bruce Braley, who included a wages line there. And again, that half of that was talking about minimum wage, and the other half of it was talking about the gender pay gap. In the more detailed discussions that they get into in the candidates in their blog posts, or as you click on different issues, only 2 of them used the word inequality, talking about income or wealth inequality. A lot of them, again, used it to talk about the gender wage gap, which is a different issue as I understand it. And Gary Peters in Michigan argued for an increase in the federal minimum wage as a way to alleviate income inequality. And then Rick Weiland in South Dakota is running as a uniquely populist candidate. He's really the only one in a top-tier Senate race who is running as a full-fledged populist. Mark Udall is a very endangered Democrat in Colorado. And when he a year ago, he was running on income inequality a little bit, and then he shifted to the war on women. He talks about contraception and abortion so much that the newspapers have started calling him Mark Uterus instead of Mark Udall. So when the Coloradan asked Udall about inequality, he said, "This is a vexing challenge." Again, this is what the American people think. It's bad. It's a vexing challenge. So he feels your pain. And then what did he propose? 4 policies: raising the minimum wage, increasing Pell Grants, increasing student loan subsidies, legislating equal pay for equal work, and hiking taxes not on people, but on companies that move jobs overseas. So the 4 policies, again, are aid for people going to college, equal pay for equal work, more Mark Uterus stuff there, this offshoring language, which is widely understood as empty rhetoric, and the minimum wage. So, of 2 of those are frankly, I mean, the college is basically money for people in the second quintile. I mean, it's money or the 4th quintile. It's money for people who are above median income. So that's swing voters. So how are we going to address income inequality? Give money to swing voters who make money against the median. That's not what's going on there. These are mostly about fairness, and that's what you have to understand. A lot of conservatives don't like it when people talk about fair share or that sort of thing, but that's the way voters think about it. And that's a good way to think about the idea of minimum wage. Why are Democrats keep bringing up minimum wage? A lot of them, they constantly pivot. What about inequality? They don't say, we need to redistribute more money, we need to increase TANF, or we need to increase food stamps, or we need to increase unemployment benefits. No, they say we need to increase minimum wage. Now, there are some redistributive effects of minimum wage. Obviously, some of the money goes from profits to minimum wage workers whose wages go up. A lot of it is a transfer from the guys who get laid off because they get replaced by a computer at McDonald's to the people who get a slight boost in the wage, or it goes from consumers to the people who get the slight boost in their wage. So as a redistributive tool, it's not obviously a good one at that, but it's fairness, and it's not fairness in the sense of what you might think of a Catholic nun talking about social justice and what we owe to the poor. It's what we owe to people for the work that they do. And this is another important thing. Did these people earn it? For the average American, you think about working and only getting $10 at the end of an hour, they think, or only getting $7 at the end of the hour, they think that's not fair. If you're actually working, you deserve more. Democrats know that that is the political view, and so that is what they're campaigning on. That's their way to get money to the poor, not the poor who are out of work, who are injured, who are sick. They're not campaigning on Medicaid. It's poor people who are working should get more money. And if you look back over the years, this is where you get bipartisan consensus on welfare reform, on all sorts of other things. And it's tapping into that public notion of fairness. And then when you talk about the rich, on the other hand, Americans have a complicated attitude towards the rich. There's a lot of distrust of the wealthy. And I'm going to argue that I think that distrust of the wealthy, like a distrust of big business, is pretty well placed. At least a wariness is deserved, because what Americans want to see is the wealthy, have they earned their wealth? And when confronted with specific examples, they usually say yes. Bill Gates, incredibly popular. He's the 5th most admired man in the world, the 5th most admired man according to all Americans in a recent poll. Pope Francis was #1, which as a Catholic cheers me, as a free enterprise person worries me a little. But Bill Gates was number 5, the richest man in America. Polls about Warren Buffett, someone polled his approval-disapproval rating, and he was up by 20 points. There's not a single politician in America who has 20 points more approval than disapproval. Oprah Winfrey, I don't know if she's still the richest woman in America, but very high approval ratings. Last time they were taken, they range between 65 and 80%. People who are rich, Americans look at them, and they don't just say, okay, that person's fine. A lot of times they admire them. They see the wealth as a sign that they did something good and they earned it. Who's not popular? Wall Street and Wall Street CEOs. For one, Wall Street disembodied, again, just becomes an abstract idea of the wealthy, and that people are distrustful or dislike that. But second, people don't necessarily see the ways in which Wall Street is generating wealth. Warren Buffett's a different thing. People know he finds companies like Dairy Queen or the candy company that do good things and need more money, and he supplies that, and that's what makes him rich. But Wall Street seems to do, high-frequency trading or derivatives. They're basically gambling. And not only are they gambling, but when they fail, we pay the bill. So some of the dislike of Wall Street's wealth is based in how it's difficult to see the value that they're providing to society unless you understand finance well. But another is they're destroying a lot of wealth when they fail and get bailed out. They don't deserve that wealth. If you're a Wall Street CEO who ran a bank and you collapse and we, the taxpayers, bailed you out, there's a sense you shouldn't still be rich. And that's where the American people come in. So when you do hear populist rhetoric from Democrats, it is about bailed out, failed CEOs, or it's about lobbyists, people who they think they're not really earning their money, they're just leveraging their personal connections. And so you look at that and you see this sense that people getting rich is great. Actually, 63% of Americans said, I think it's good that there is a class of rich people. And most people want to be rich, and less than you'd think. But most people want to be rich, and they think they can be. That might be uniquely American. I wonder if that's true over in Europe. But most people want to be rich, and they look at individual rich people, and they mostly think they earn their money. So what are Democrats talking about when they talk about the wealthy? When they talk about Charles and David Koch, they don't point out how Charles and David Koch, what their businesses are or anything like that. Some of it would be awkward because I think Koch Industries owns a pollution control system, so they're probably benefiting from more environmental regulations. But they don't care about that. What they care about is the fact that the Kochs or these other billionaires, not the Democrats, those don't get talked about, but the Republican billionaires have a disproportionate voice in politics, and that's something that people see as unfair. We can deal with an unequal distribution of wealth if people earn it, but nobody has the right to have a bigger voice in a democracy than I do. So pay close attention. When the Democrats are bashing billionaires, they're not bashing them. This is the top-tier Senate candidates. They're not bashing them for being rich. They're bashing them for buying elections or for having too much of a voice in politics. And I say that a lot of these views, these public views, even though you may see it as being more left than what you would like, I think they're grounded in good economic sense because they're grounded in the idea that profit should be tied to the creation of value. And in America, for the most part, it is. You get rich by creating something people want or supplying it or financing it or something like that. But sometimes profit's not tied to the creation of value, and Americans dislike that. And they should. And the economy dislikes that. And so with my last few minutes here, I was going to talk about, in my paper, I cite a recent paper that looked into when does inequality matter? Because one of the arguments about inequality is that it's not just morally wrong, but it actually hurts the economy the more unequal we are. And there's a lot of back and forth about that. And one thing that I've seen in the studies I've looked at is that income inequality doesn't hurt the broader economy, but stark wealth inequality is correlated. So not income, but the wealth you have is correlated with economic stagnation. But these two looked into Sartitha Bagchi of University of Michigan and Jan Svejnar of Columbia University. They looked at certain cases, countries over a time period where inequality grew, and was that correlated with economic stagnation? And in some it was, and in some it wasn't. And they divided them into two classes, and they said, why sometimes is wealth inequality going up go hand in hand with stagnation? And this is the distinction they came up with. Wealth inequality reduces economic growth, but when we control for the fact that some billionaires acquired their wealth through political connections, the effect of politically connected wealth inequality is negative, meaning politically connected wealth inequality hurts the economy, while politically unconnected wealth inequality has no significant effect. You can sum it up this way. When inequality is a result of cronyism, that goes hand in hand with an economy going downhill or being flat. And when inequality is a result of free enterprise competition, of people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates getting rich by doing smart stuff with their money and by getting lucky, frankly, but creating good things, then the economy grows. And they created a strict test for cronyism. It wasn't just enough to have benefited from a government policy. And it wasn't just enough to have been close to politicians. You have to have been close to politicians and that be the source of your wealth. So again, Warren Buffett's a fundraiser for Barack Obama. He invested in Goldman Sachs right before the Wall Street bailout. He makes money off of solar panel stuff. This is what I write about day in, day out. But it's nothing on the level of the cronyism that happens in places like Indonesia or Russia, Soviet Union right after the collapse, or Putin's Russia today. Those things are really the examples of cronyist wealth that they give are Carlos Slim in Mexico, who got rich through some policies that were for him, or the sudden spurt in billionaires in Russia in the 1990s, or they say Indonesia, where during the Suharto regime, it really mattered whether one knew Suharto because he could make all the difference in obtaining a lucrative import license or not. So the moral sense that the Americans have, that the Democrats are trying to gently play, is that being rich isn't bad, but you should have to earn it. And you shouldn't have more of a say in politics. And being poor, Democrats don't talk about poverty anymore, but they say that if you're working, you earn money and you deserve some more of it. So then I want to just finally look, what should we worry about in America today? I find it troubling that 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties are within commuting distance of the United States Capitol. It's good for my property value in Montgomery County, Maryland, but it's troubling. It's a sign that while we are the freest or one of the freest economies, and that getting wealthy is correlated with creation of value, there are steps going in the other direction. And so if government continues to increase its role in the economy and continues to determine more and more who is rich and what you have to do to get rich, then you can expect the public mood, Americans, to turn more and more the way they feel about wealth in South America, which is that it's inherently undeserved. And at that point, inequality will go from being a nuanced, subtle issue to being a fiery storm. And so the growth of government, ironically, will lead to more demands for the growth of government. But as it is now, it's a complicated issue. People don't hate you for being rich. People don't necessarily blame you for being poor. But if you earn it, and they think you earn it, that's what they're looking for, and that's what the politicians are talking about. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Tim. We had 3 excellent papers, and we have opportunities for questions. And so if you have a question, raise your hand, and our people will get to you. Let me say this. We especially appreciate it when you ask a question if the question is shorter than the answer. Thank you for that. Very good. We have about 15 to 20 minutes, I think, for questions.
In the back.
Okay, in the back? Go ahead. And you might address the panelists that you have the question for. We have our mics are on so we can answer them.
It's for all 3 of them. I believe that justice is historical. It's in the process, not the outcome. And I believe that based on this taxation is nothing but armed robbery, especially if it's for redistribution. What I'm not sure I believe is that welfare tends to lower inequality. Some of the numbers seem to suggest that the poor are getting more out of this. What I've learned from Milton Friedman is that welfare programs unintentionally rob the needy to give to people who don't have the need. And P.J. O'Rourke last night mentioned that within a few years, the baby boomers, the wealthiest minority, will be getting half of the federal spending. So I would like you to address this one. Thank you.
Michael, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, part of it is that when we define what we mean by welfare, we often tend to focus on welfare for the poor, when the reality is there's so many other groups that get welfare. We often ignore welfare for the elderly, for example, in terms of Social Security and Medicare. We ignore corporate welfare that Tim writes about so eloquently. We ignore welfare for the military-industrial complex and so on. That said, we do spend, at the federal and state level combined, about $1 trillion a year on welfare. Robert's done a lot of work on this. I have a new paper out on it as well. And that has had, I think, very marginal results in recent years. There's some debate, I think, about whether or not it had some impact initially. We certainly have done something in terms of material poverty for the poor, the type of hunger that went on, for example, in America in the 1960s when Michael Harrington was writing about the other American stuff. That's largely been done away with. But we haven't seen much in terms of gains, in terms of getting people out of poverty, certainly in recent years, despite massive increases in welfare policy. So we do some good in terms of alleviating material poverty, but we don't do much in terms of gaining people to sort of getting them out of poverty that we really want to do.
Robert, go ahead.
When you look at the $1 trillion a year that's in means-tested aid, that's aid to low-income and poor people, half of that goes to disabled people or elderly people in nursing homes. It would be pretty difficult to say that there's a huge moral hazard issue there. Sure. And it probably is a fairly reasonable redistribution of income without tremendous negative side effects. The other half of it is predominantly going to single-parent families. That's about $450 billion a year. And so one of the most pertinent things about the war on poverty, on which we've spent about $22 trillion since Lyndon Johnson, is that when Johnson launched the war on poverty, 7% of children in the United States were born outside of marriage. Today, that's not 42%. So in effect, what the welfare state did by subsidizing predominantly single parenthood, essentially replacing the husband with a welfare check, and also rather aggressively, remarkably penalizing low-income couples who do get married. We take around $12,000 of welfare benefits away if a low-income mother marries the father of her kids. Great incentive system there. And we've been doing this for 40 years. Effectively, the welfare state is generating a need for itself by doing that. The problem is that you could go all the way back to Charles Murray and losing ground. Just saying, well, let's get rid of it, gets about 5 votes in the House of Representatives, and at Heritage we go for 15 at least, minimum. So the question is, once you've essentially introduced this toxic drug, you've addicted a vast portion of the population to it. About 70% of poor families with children are single-parent families. You cannot jerk that money away to any time in the short term without causing horrendous hardship. And so the question is, how do you back out of that system and actually begin to repair some of the damage that you've done? Unfortunately, I thought we made a tiny positive first step toward that in welfare reform in the 90s. The Republicans then turned around and ignored the issue to death for 20 years, even though it was largely regarded as their major accomplishment in the 90s. I think that, in fact, conservatives conservatives need to not be sucked into the idea, well, welfare state, we just need to get rid of it. Because, again, you got 5 votes there. You got Ron Paul. But that's all you get. And part of the reason we can't reform this is exactly that attitude. Just get rid of it. Turn it over to the churches. I'm sorry, $1 trillion a year is more than the entire budget of all the churches in the United States. Okay, you have to be more realistic about this. I think conservatives and libertarians probably have better ideas to actually make this system smaller and make it help poor people rather than making them totally dependent on government. But you have to be willing to take those incremental steps and not just ignore the issue, which is unfortunately what the Republican Party has done for 20 years.
Okay. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment on the politics of that, following up on what Robert just said there. In January 2012, we had a rare moment where two guys won the Iowa caucuses, and so both of them gave victory speeches. It was Rick Santorum and Mitt Romney. And at one point in each of their speeches, they both spoke about the welfare state. And Romney talked about we should be, a nation of opportunity, not a nation of entitlement. And Rick Santorum said, Republicans need to help people, have opportunities and free them from dependency on the welfare state. So they were both talking about the same policy, but the bad guys in Romney's telling were the victims in Santorum's telling. And I think Santorum's telling is right, that a lot of people on welfare end up feeling trapped, especially if you're on disability. That's one of the biggest ones, and Robert knows this much better than I do. But also, if nobody's going to listen to you if you start from the idea that you're attacking poor people. And I think starting from an idea that's common to Christians and to people of all sorts of faiths, you have an obligation to take care of the poor, to feed the hungry, to house the homeless, to take care of the poor. We just don't know the best way to do it, and we know that the current way isn't working. If you start from that premise, you're going to have a lot more luck than if you start from the premise of saying, these darn poor people don't deserve my money. That's my understanding of the politics.
Okay, good. Another question.
To Tim,
Go ahead, sir.
Carney, and I think, again, congrats. I think you hit the nail on the head. You spoke how cronyism, is seen and creates unjust inequalities. For those of us who work internationally, we see it all over. 2/3 of the world doesn't have rule of law. So when when you have that situation, inequality is not something that we can just do not care. The most successful economic transformation in the last 2 decades took place in Chile. More people were lifted out of poverty there than almost in percentage than almost any part in the world. But the language of inequality alone was able to elect a government that is reversing all the reforms. Now, you spoke about cronyism. The country, #1 country in the Index of Economic Freedom of Cato and of Heritage, Hong Kong, was ranked #1 in cronyism by The Economist. The #2 country in economic freedom in those indices, Singapore, was ranked #5 in cronyism. So my question to you, have you studied the index of cronyism? Because we don't have no idea how much of the wealth is generated by injustice.
Yeah.
And how much of the wealth is created by just exchanges. The moral defense of capitalism, it will be very difficult.
It's a poorly defined generally and difficult to define term, cronyism. Again, the study that I looked at just went on a case-by-case basis over every billionaire in each country and studied news accounts and used other people's studies of economic corruption to come up with what they admitted was a subjective and an imperfect measure. The Economist one, I remember seeing the rankings, and I don't know how they did their rankings. One problem is that people on the left think that it's cronyist if you cut taxes. And if you cut taxes across the board, or if you deregulate across the board, or I've even been told that when I'm saying that the U.S. government shouldn't be subsidizing exports, that's cronyism because that would benefit the domestic companies that compete with the foreign companies that are getting the subsidies from the U.S. government. So if you have the totalitarian view of government that Folsom was talking about, where everything belongs to the state, then there is no difference between free enterprise or cronyism, right? Everything you have is given to you by Big Brother, then it's all just favoritism. And so that's part of the problem, is what the definition you're going to come up with has to start from an idea of rule of law, property rights, and an idea of liberty, and not an idea that everything you have is given to you by the government. So I agree that that should be part of the project of people who care about economic liberty, is defining and explaining what cronyism means. And I'll admit, in most of my writing, I've gone by sort of who was the Supreme Court justice who had the test for pornography, which is I know it when I see it. On cronyism, that's largely the way I do it, and I think it would be a very important project to better define corporatism, corporate welfare, and cronyism.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir, go ahead.
I have a question, I guess, to Tim. To what degree do you think this issue of income inequality is related to the decline in biblical influence in our society? And I'm talking about not only from the schools, but from the homes. Because the Bible, of course, teaches that we're all gifted differently, and the Bible warns against envy, being envious of what others earn. Now, again, I don't envy Bert up here. I know he's been gifted, but also he's been given an opportunity. And so that's one reason that I don't gift him, or I don't envy him. But we need to remember that with freedom comes responsibility, and that's already been mentioned by you. We have a responsibility to help the poor, but help them properly. And this comes not only from the home, but from the church and from society in general. And again, I think if we believed in this and if we tried to do it more, that there would be less of this problem of envy and problem with income distribution, and we would build a better society.
Yeah, I think that envy actually isn't that big of a problem in the U.S., is what I came across looking through all this polling data. People don't hate Bill Gates, they love Bill Gates. I'd like to look at Western Europe, which is less Christian than the U.S. by far, and do they have the same attitudes towards wealth? In South America, there are different attitudes. And again, I think the Holy Father's attitudes toward his writings on capitalism come from an environment where it is perceived that, trickle down here is a term that Democrats use to describe if somebody gets to keep their own money. But trickle down in South America is the government gives money to one of his buddies, the politicians do, and they say, well, this will also create jobs for the lower down. It really is giving money to the people at the top, expecting it to trickle down. I call it feeding the birds by feeding the horses, if you want to process that image in your mind for but so the idea, so we don't really have that much of an envy problem here, and maybe part of it is that I don't know. Sometimes I think all the enterprising people got on a boat and left Europe, and everybody else stayed behind. Or maybe it is our Christian, or that we're more Christian. But it's more of a problem in other countries, and it might be justified in other countries like South America. It might be a character flaw in places like Europe. But the Democrats, the fact that they ran away from the issue is a sign that their attempts to play to straight envy didn't work. That's how I understand it.
Interesting. Robert, go ahead.
A little side on that is, it's very interesting if you go back in the history of Lyndon Johnson launching the war on poverty in 1964, what the bureaucrats and academics wanted was actually a war on inequality. That's what they cared about. They were effectively proto-Rawlsians, and that's what they wanted. And Johnson said, one, this is disastrous. The American people has no interest in this at all. Plus, I don't agree with you. That's stupid. I'm interested in actually the actual material deprivation at the bottom. But even more, he honestly he wanted poor people to be able to support themselves. He said he wanted to turn the poor from being tax eaters into taxpayers. Try to find any Republican who'd use rhetoric like that today. And honestly, I mean, the guy was a very bag of hot air, but he actually believed that. And he really said that he wanted to deal with material deprivation, but also make people self-sufficient. And the left still sticks with that. The left actually has this revised thing that is an inequality measure that Obama has put in place, but they don't call it inequality, they call it relative poverty. Now, it would absolutely put everyone in this audience totally to sleep to explain what relative poverty is. But effectively, it's an inequality measure, but they can't say that. I think that's very striking. They can't say that. The Europeans also use this thing, the same inequality measure, but they all call it poverty. And they want the public to believe that what they're trying to deal with is the guy who's sleeping under the bridge. You know, and in fact, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. It does have to do with leveling society, but they don't want anybody to understand that's what they're doing.
Okay. I feel very envied right now because I have the power to dismiss you for lunch. I'd like to thank our panelists, Michael Tanner, Robert Rector, and Tim Carney. And I do dismiss you for lunch. Our ballroom E, right next door, is where we will be having our lunch. Thank you very much.